Morning, everyone. So my name's Alistair Thomas, and I'm Associate Director and head up our UK LCA team. It was great to see so many familiar faces out in the foyer, but also plenty of you who I don't recognise, so please connect with me later in the day. I look forward to that. Thanks to OneClick for inviting us to present this keynote speech. As Andrew mentioned, I've worked in the LCA world for a decade now on various levels, buildings, infrastructure, master planning. But, and this is where I try not to catch anyone's eye, the people in this room, we're carbon experts, and I'm sure many of you can beat me on that 10 years. So, rather than run through a series of technical updates, many of which you probably already absorbed, I decided to tell the story of where we are a little bit differently. I went and spoke to carbon non-experts, and that's a phrase that they were happy to wear, not one that I pinned on them. And I sat down with stakeholders who understand construction and sustainability well, but aren't necessarily doing LCA day to day. So that was varied from developers, project managers, contractors, people whose decisions shape what actually gets built. And what they said was illuminating, not necessarily because it was surprising, but because it revealed a consistent pattern. And I think in part that explains why, as an industry, progress has not been as fast as we need it to be. And what those conversations revealed was not a technical story, it was a behavioural one. And it also raised the possibility in my mind that some of this thinking has crept into the carbon experts. So I might put that to the test today too. And finally, I'll share 3 things I think we can all do differently, and I hope they provide a useful lens for the amazing case studies and other talks that we'll hear from later today. So, hopefully, without having given away too much already, I've got a question on the slide. It's a genuine one. I'd like you to think about it and hold the answer in your mind for the next half hour. So when a whole life carbon report lands in your inbox, whoever you are, wherever you sit in the construction process, what is the very first thing that you look for? I'll come back to this question at the end, and I'll tell you what I think my answer would be. But first, to set some context for what I'm going to say, it's worth spending a moment looking back at where we've come from. So when I prepare these talks, I like to look back at what we were presenting about a year or so ago. And this is a slide that we were referencing a lot a year ago. And it's a useful benchmark to assess some of the changes we've seen. It represented just a subset of changes in discipline guidance, methodology, targets. And we've got the GLA there as an example for policy, as at the time its methodology and requirements were some of the most detailed. But there were and have been changes across local planning authorities across the country. And in that 5-year period, there was a remarkable amount of activity, and I'm sure many of the people in this room were directly involved. And what's encouraging is that the more recent updates do show a positive trend, better alignment in methodology and language across frameworks than we ever had before. And that will benefit the industry. But that transition period in pink that mostly came from the shift to the RIC second edition has not resolved itself yet. And that matters, as I'll talk about. And then, since that slide, if anything, pace has accelerated. We've got the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, local policy updates, as I mentioned, such as in Greater Manchester, sector updates from the Future Homes Hub and others, the update to BREEAM version 7 and the new MATO 1 credit awardal in there. And these are just a few examples, and I'm sure between us we could name dozens, if not hundreds more. And then on the bottom there, so we've got the latest UK government carbon budget and delivery plan. And there were some useful nuggets in there. It explicitly recognised that electricity prices must fall if we are to electrify at the pace required. And it also included the clearest government commitment yet to tackling embodied carbon of buildings going forwards. And there's been a suite of other government documents. So the Future Homes Hub building standard with much tighter energy efficiency requirements, and also an acknowledgement there to cover embodied carbon soon. The ACOM, practical, technical and economic impacts of measuring and reducing embodied carbon, which was commissioned by the MHCLG. So we've got government now funding this work. And then this was followed by the Embodied Carbon Summit in November last year. And I would highly recommend this summary report that I've got on the screen if you haven't read it already. So rather than just presenting recommendations, it's a brilliant reference point for latest solutions and guidance in the industry. And it's formed actually a lot of the basis of conversations I've had since. So the landscape looks nothing like it did a few years ago. The question is whether our practice has kept up with that pace. And it hasn't, not yet. As I'm sure we all agree, there is still a way to go. And firstly, in carbon measurement alignment, that transition phase that I was talking about before. And this is an example of how it does remain, if you look at the comparison against various reporting frameworks. And whilst there is improved alignment in those more recent documents and methodology updates, for example, BREEAM and the NZCBS both cite RIC 2nd edition, there are still inherent differences. So BREEAM version 7 considers environmental impact indicators beyond carbon. It's got a slightly different study period of 50 years, and it considers targets for A to C only. And then there's the remaining bigger discrepancy with slightly older documentation. LETI-REBA targets and the GLA process are still calibrated to version 1. And when you're trying to compare under the old scope against more recent targets set under a new scope, you aren't comparing like for like. So we're in between things. The old system's been superseded. The new system isn't fully bedded in everywhere. And in that gap, trust me, there is still a lot of confusion about which standard applies, which targets to use, and comparing yesterday's project with today's requirements. And this definitely isn't a criticism of any one of those frameworks. They were each developed at different point in the industry's journey with slightly different purposes. The challenge, and this is a theme that I'll come back to, is in how they're being implemented and reported by practitioners on the ground. And here's the other challenge, maybe the more important one. So according to the UK GBC Whole Life Carbon Roadmap Progress Report, emissions across the built environment have fallen just 14% since 2018. The required reduction to stay on a credible net zero trajectory was 24% by 2024. So we are significantly behind. And on the right-hand side there, the big calls to action in that document: ending fossil fuels in buildings, making retrofit a national priority, mandating whole life carbon assessments. These are the step changes that will move the needle significantly. And all of us in the room are, in some way, working to accelerate those levers. And there is genuine reason for optimism about their trajectory. But today, I want to focus on something maybe more immediate: the gap between what our industry already knows how to do and what is actually being done on most projects. Because that gap is real, and I think it's where the biggest near-term opportunity lies. So, as part of reviewing a whole lot of whole life carbon work in my role, I found myself consistently disappointed with what I was seeing and the extent to which assessments were actually driving change on projects. So I started asking why, and that led me to these discussions with the carbon non-experts. So throughout my discussions, I asked people where the UK carbon industry had made genuine progress. And there were 2 areas and 3 specific documents that came up consistently. So on the left, you've got measurement and transparency, the standardisation, the data infrastructure, the reporting requirements that are making carbon performance visible. It may come as no surprise that RIC 2nd edition cropped up many times in those discussions. And then on the right of the diagram, carbon targets. So that's the benchmarks, the caps, the commitments. And there, the NZCBS and BREEAM version 7 cropped up many times. And both of these are real, and both have delivered genuine progress. But to me, and hopefully many others, there is an obvious missing piece, and I'll come to that in a moment. But first, I explored the potential pitfalls if you focused only on these 2 areas. So, if we start with measurement and transparency, or carbon accounting. Well, firstly, there are major positives to this. As previously noted, the measurement infrastructure that exists in the UK LCA world is thorough. Globally, the RIC's whole life carbon assessment methodology is one of the most comprehensive and practical frameworks for assessments. and it forms the bedrock for most of the UK reporting requirements. Then, alongside this, we have ever-increasing disclosure of data, allowing for improved comparability. Data that was submitted to the standard planning requirements to submit data to the BECD, and BREEAM credits now for public disclosure of data are 3 examples. And then finally, alongside this, there is gradually becoming an agreed set of baseline carbon data for key elements through guidance such as the iStruct-E, and then the recent release of the UK LCA. An increasing number of products have EPDs or TM65 data. And the result of all of that is that there has been a significant uptake in whole-life carbon assessments, and measurement is driving positive conversation in reducing emissions. But here on the right-hand side is a quote that stayed with me most from the conversations in this area. Lots of the progress has improved consistency of measurement by carbon specialists, but it was felt there was still a lack of wider understanding, which is leading to confusion and inconsistent delivery, particularly for those who are just starting on their carbon measurement journey. Many I spoke to referenced the sort of saturation of industry updates with sometimes conflicting messages within them. And so measuring carbon is clearly a very powerful asset for the industry. That's why we're here. But in my opinion, it does carry a risk. There is a genuine risk that all this infrastructure we've built, as valuable as it is, can become a substitute for change. So firstly, I've pulled out 3 challenges. So to undertake compliant assessments, often to multiple scopes for a single project, okay, it takes time and fee, and I know that was mentioned previously, but most importantly maybe, it does require expertise. Currently, quality is inconsistent. I often see errors in design stage and post-construction assessments, missing building elements, carbon factors applied incorrectly, transport based on just the final journey leg, rather than the full picture, because that's what was in the construction data platform on site. And AI will reduce time and cost significantly, and I know OneClick have something interesting coming in the next few weeks, which I'm sure they'll discuss later at their upcoming product launch. But the need for genuine carbon expertise doesn't go away. The models are only as good as the judgment applied to them. To take a straightforward example, and hopefully you wouldn't have to be a carbon expert to pick this up, but this is what we're seeing. I recently reviewed an assessment that was produced entirely from a BIM model where reinforcement was simply unaccounted for because it wasn't physically there in the Revit model. I've seen MEP assessments that only covered a portion of the building services because it wasn't in scope to model all of the MEP systems within BIM. So missing of key elements is sadly still common. And then there are areas which maybe aren't quite fully defined by guidance that are slightly open to interpretation, such as consistent carbon factor data, maybe particularly for MEP, where we tend to see the biggest discrepancies in reporting. And there are also discussions about reporting benefits of carbon storage and rebound factors for scarce materials, which we do see applied slightly differently. And finally, third-party verification is limited and the bar is not well defined. There's often no clear standard for what a third-party review should actually cover. And it will be interesting to see how the NZCBS verification process details that in the coming weeks. In my view, there's got to be significant, specific evidence requirements for key elements. So for concretes, pour logs that are mapped to an EPD, for steel, mill certificates. Otherwise, genuine third-party reviewing becomes really very challenging and very, very time-consuming. And so, alongside that, there may be slightly more subtle risks. A carbon accounting culture, spoken to people where every tonne is documented and there's kind of this false comfort that the problem is under control. Process becomes the product. So, submitting a whole-life carbon report, achieving a BREEAM Matter 1 credit, disclosing their carbon for their ESG reporting. These have become signals of seriousness, and they are, but precision in measurement should sharpen urgency. And whether design fundamentally changed due to these processes is a completely separate question, and in my experience, very often it doesn't. And there's also that risk that without a third-party verification process in place, more detailed assessments often just produce higher carbon values, which creates this perverse incentive to actually be less thorough and look better. There are examples, sadly, where projects have won sustainability awards based on their carbon credentials which were not correctly calculated. And then industry confusion, so conflicting reports with different messages, some sector-specific documents reporting results that do not marry with the NZCBS limits. It just creates an environment where people lose confidence in the numbers, and without confidence in the numbers, people won't act. My view, and this is shared by many, is that we need a two-tier system going forwards, similar to maybe how Part L and neighbours work for operational energy. So you've got Part Z, a national baseline methodology, standardised assumptions, and national carbon database embedded in policy with assumptions baked into the reporting tool itself. Simple enough to reduce user error and improve coverage, much like RE 2020 in France. And then on top of that, a rigorous third-party verification pathway for those who are seeking higher certification. So now the other track, carbon targets. Goodhart's law states that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. I'm not saying that's what's happened, but I am asking whether it might be starting to. So again, the industry is lined against a suite of benchmarks. The UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, first independent cross-sector certification. Then at a local level, we've got an increased number of LPAs with carbon targets. We've got material benchmarks such as the LCCG and GCCA benchmarks for concrete. And then client commitments and science-based targets cascading down from investors and through the value chain. That is, as again, a quote from my discussions on this slide says, a genuine powerful suite of instruments that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. Sustainability ambition has hardened, and it has led to accountability and a business case for carbon reductions, which is driving action. But in some cases, it has produced a mindset, compliance over transformation, hitting the number, sometimes at the expense of rethinking the system. So I've come up with a few potential watch points, which I've actively seen on projects. So firstly, reliance on known solutions, reliance on supply chain decarbonisation as the primary lever. A significant number of projects that I review are celebrating low carbon results that are almost entirely dependent on EAF steel or similar upstream material changes that often rely on scarce materials. That's not wrong. Supply chain decarbonisation is an essential part of the journey, and we need to find ways to drive that demand to continue it. But when it becomes the starting point rather than a supporting measure, it crowds out those harder designed questions. And individual reports claiming reputational credit for purchasing decisions that depend on contested resources is not really a stable foundation in my view. And then it can all fall apart when supply chain faces challenges, such as with steel at the moment. War, the upcoming steel tariffs and CBAM implications are tightening the market and exposing projects to pricing or carbon risk, and we're seeing that on live jobs now. And alongside that, novel and innovative approaches do not necessarily deliver immediate carbon savings, but they are integral to long-term global progress. One example, calcined clay. It may not outperform alternative cement replacements in a single project assessment currently, but it is part of the pathway to fundamentally lower carbon concrete at scale. And if every project decision is optimised for the benefit of that single project alone, we never build the evidence base that we need. We need more groups like the Accelerating Concrete Decarbonisation Group willing to take that longer view. And I'd argue for possibly even more innovative materials and even more low carbon solutions, such as bio-based composites, for example. Then secondly, the perils of shifting targets, time and energy spent on target numbers rather than solutions. I've sat in numerous contractor appointments, planning negotiations, where very knowledgeable people have spent significant time arguing about whether the target should be 600 or 605 kilograms of CO2 per square metre. And in the vast majority of those cases, it wasn't the design that changed. The number shifted to accommodate growing industry knowledge, or it was picking up elements that had been missed in a previous iteration of the assessment. I find myself asking the question, is that time and effort going to the best possible use? What if it were directed towards solutions instead? Carbon tunnel vision. We must be careful not to optimise for one metric at the expense of everything else. Low carbon specification choices that carry supply chain human rights risks, for example, are a real problem. Child labour in the extraction and processing of materials is not a hypothetical, it is a documented risk in some supply chains. We cannot let carbon be the only filter. Building level decision making, portfolio district and infrastructure level scale is ultimately often where decisions about demand are actually made. A building by building target framework can sometimes miss that. And area-based metrics incentivising the wrong decisions. I still see, despite the guidance, refurbishment versus redevelopment assessments, where redevelopment is justified because it produced a lower kilograms of CO2 per square metre value, but only because the gross internal area increased substantially. Total emissions were far, far higher. We should be able to celebrate projects that build less, not projects that dilute a bigger number across more floor space. And whilst I may only agree with it in part, the quote on the slide was one of the most significant takeaways from all of my conversations. The problem lies not in the frameworks or targets themselves, but how they are being implemented by people on projects. For example, having spoken with them, and I imagine there are some in the room, I know that the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard Technical Steering Group is aware of many of these potential watch points, and they already have some measures in place to understand them, such as the additional reporting of results with the industry standard carbon factors. Now, speaking with colleagues, we liken the potential similarities to BREEAM. What started out as a certification began to be used as a design tool. And that's great, embedding sustainability principles into the design and construction space. But all too often now we see this has just worked back from the target, with the easiest route to achievement being the path taken, rather than necessarily the most impactful. And that is why the BRE are having to update BREEAM to keep it relevant, and we need to be wary of updating our carbon targets to be relevant. So I reflected on all this for a while, and the conclusion I came to is maybe not comfortable, but I do think it's honest. Carbon measurement, of course, is important. Carbon targets, of course, are important. But if that's where a lot of the industry's energy is going, is it really surprising that we're not decarbonising fast enough? Has the focus been so much on these items that sometimes we forget what actually really matters? And it sounds obvious, but this is the reality. In my mind, what was missing in many, not all of my conversations, was telling. And then even those who had been involved in groundbreaking projects were keen to first tell me about the targets that they'd achieved. Whereas actually, what I really wanted, and where I think we should focus the effort, is on action and change. So here's the framework I want to offer. 3 wheels: carbon targets, measurement and transparency, and impactful change, and in some cases, innovation. For the system to work, all 3 of those have to be turning together. And then underneath all 3, the upward arrow, raising the floor, getting whole-scale uptake, bringing the vast majority of projects that aren't engaged with any of these frameworks at all along that journey. And perhaps that part's the least glamorous, but in many ways the most important. A 5% reduction in embodied carbon across the average project applied to the targeted 300,000 homes to be built annually in the UK outweighs a 40% reduction on 50 flagship schemes. National carbon performance is set by the median project, not the leading edge. And right now, often we see the median project is barely touched. Having said that, today we will hear from those projects that are pushing the boundaries, and that is really important. The presentations will be exciting, looking forward to every single one of them. They'll include things like building less, using differently, circular economy as default, not aspiration. Design for disassembly embedded in the brief. But let me be honest about what I find when I talk to the wider built environment. Most of the practitioners knew the compliance tools, they knew RICS, NZCBS, BREEAM. Fewer were aware of or are using the guidance that will actually drive real change, just a few of which I've got as examples on the screen. And I've got the Westminster Retrofit First policy in there, as in my mind it's one of the few that engages all 3 of those aspects. It has measurement, it has targets, but it also has requirements to actively change on projects. And the quotes in pink there, just a couple of many that came up during my discussions. We cannot use timber for insurance and fire safety reasons. But when I asked if they were aware of, for example, the Mass Timber Insurance Playbook or the Commercial Timber Guidebook, the answer was no. And again, I would highly recommend that Embodied Carbon Summit summary document for good practice and real examples. So here's what I think is really going on. Those barriers are real in some cases. They are also being overstated. The industry has solved them on specific projects, which is precisely why we'll hear those case studies today. The problem is not that the solutions don't exist. The problem is that we are not telling the story of how the barriers were overcome well enough for others to follow. The knowledge is there, the reach isn't, and that gap is what I'll focus the rest of this talk on. So, what can we do? I've distilled my answer into three things. I'm sure there are many more, but three actions that sit along those wider, larger structural changes the industry needs, but that many of us can start on immediately. So, firstly, consultants, not accountants. And this applies no matter where in the value chain you sit. Change the terminology as suits. But our job is not to review or produce assessments only. Our job is to ask the difficult questions that change the design. And of course, the earlier those questions are asked, the more they can change things. So within Buro Happold, as part of our carbon reduction route map, we've produced a set of questions that, obviously where relevant and from an engineering consultancy perspective, are to be asked on projects, whether we have a sustainability appointment or not. They align with the PAS 2080 carbon reduction hierarchy, and I've put a few up on the screen for reference, which will hopefully get you thinking. These questions do not require a detailed LCA. They require someone willing to ask them early enough in the process so that the answers can change something. That's, in my mind, what it means to be a consultant rather than an accountant. And in my experience, it's probably the single most effective thing any of us can do on projects. Secondly, storytelling. It's evident that we're currently not doing this well enough to engage those decision makers to take action. And that applies at all stages. I know there's interesting work across the sector in this space, particularly combining cost and carbon effectively. I'll give an example of some of the things we're doing at Buro Happold. We've recently adapted our rapid prototyping process to consider reuse optioneering alongside massing of new builds. You can see a clip of the game engine interface that we've developed to try and add that visual storytelling to help get the message across. So the idea is that we'll discuss and agree importance weightings of various factors with the client, rapid assessment of those, combine them into prototypes, and then present those prototypes with scored results, as you can see on the bottom right-hand side there, which relate to performative outcomes. So embedding LCA as a generative design tool rather than a retrospective check, and mapping it alongside other factors that are of importance to the client. This allows it to be considered as equal without just being treated maybe as an add-on. And as I mentioned, carbon is one metric among many. The power of this early stage optioneering is the ability to navigate trade-offs across multiple performance dimensions simultaneously. So here, 5 options, 8 criteria. We could have many more, but we chose those that the client really wanted to focus on. And they're assessed simultaneously, not sequentially, not traded off against each other after decisions are made, but evaluated at the same time before anything is fixed. And of course, there's no single right answer here. The right answer that you might choose depends on many factors. But this conversation, this kind of optioneering, is only possible if carbon and that full suite of performance metrics are in the room at stage 0 or stage 1. And that often isn't the case. Any later, these decisions are made, the floor plate is largely fixed, and that opportunity to navigate the full matrix has gone. So I really think we need to improve our storytelling of this early stage optioneering to help this to be considered more commonly. And third and finally, share the how, not just the what. And this connects directly to what you're about to hear from the other speakers today. When we present case studies and project outcomes, we typically share what the solution was, why it was low carbon, where it was used. That's useful, but it's not enough. What actually changes behaviour in the wider industry is knowing what the barriers were, how they were overcome on a real project, and what matters for the next one. Practitioners need confidence, not just options. So commercial risks need to have been de-risked in practice. Supply chain supply chain constraints need to be navigated with evidence. Document and communicate the journey. So, as you listen to the presentations today, I would encourage you to ask about the how, because the how is where the knowledge lives that can actually change what happens on the next project. And so, just to close, what is the first thing that you consider when you review a whole life carbon report? Scope, yes, important. Methodology, important. But if my thinking is correct, then I can imagine at least a few people answered with upfront or life cycle carbon results. Measurement and target comparison. These things are of course necessary and they are important, but I just think we might start to have a little more impact if we all considered action first. So the first thing I look at when I review a report is what question was asked that changed the design. What recommendation was made, was acted upon. Because a project that documents carbon perfectly and changed absolutely nothing in the design is, in the most precise sense of the word, a carbon accounting exercise. And it's not what the industry needs, and it's not what the planet needs. So my closing message is be carbon movers, not just carbon measurers. Thank you.